The sea kept its secret for more than 7 decades. A cold, silent mausoleum lying in black water where light seldom reaches. When the first faint ping of a returning sonar echoed across the abyss, it was like awakening an enormous sleeping memory. The discovery of the RMS Titanic's wreck in 1985 reopened a chapter of 20th century modernity frozen in salt and shadow. It was not merely an archaeological find. It was an encounter with a story, one that reached past nostalgia into the messy, human heart of history. The expedition that finally located the Titanic married relentless curiosity with cutting-edge technology. Researchers, engineers, and determined adventurers pooled resources and imagination, designing machines that could speak with the deepest parts of the ocean. Towed sonar arrays sent back ghostly contours. Remotely operated vehicles streamed images from a world utterly alien to human sight. Those first images showed an enormous silhouette strewn on the seafloor, a hulking shape that at once confirmed long-held suspicions and opened 100 new questions. Approaching the wreck was an act of reverence and risk. The pressure at nearly 2.5 miles below the surface is crushing, measured not only in pounds per square inch, but in the way it compresses human imagination. The submersibles, sealed and brave, descended through a blue that grew thin and then absent, leaving only the glow of their lights to paint the abyssal plain. When those lights fell upon the Titanic, the spectacle was beyond a single emotion. Deck rails curled like the ribs of some enormous drowned animal. The bow, partially buried in silt, jutted like an accusation into a world that no longer held signposts of time and place. What made the discovery profoundly moving was its human texture. Names scrolled on passenger lists and crew rosters were suddenly tethered to a physical place, where fate had separated stories into fragments. Letters, trunks, and a child's shoe lay scattered about the decks, mute testimonies to lives cut abruptly short. Objects designed for ordinary use utensils, hairbrushes, a lady's compact, became the most eloquent survivors. To see them, where the ship had fallen, was to recognize that the Titanic had carried real people with mundane belongings and private routines, not merely a headline or statistic. Yet the wreck told an equally clear mechanical tale. The vessel's breakage, the way the hull had ruptured and settled in 2 major sections, revealed forces that extended beyond the immediate trauma of a single night in icy water. Metal twisted and sheared in ways that taught engineers where stresses had gathered, how seams had failed, and how the very modernity of steel could yield suddenly to nature's indifferent geometry. Rediscovery allowed minds to reconstruct the sequence of events with technical specificity, to translate rumor and speculation into empirical narrative. The find also propelled debate. Should such a solemn underwater grave be treated as an archaeological site, meticulously studied and conserved, or as a tomb left undisturbed out of respect? Conservationists argued for protection and minimal interference. Scholars urged careful excavation where it would yield knowledge. Others saw opportunity for museums, films, and commercial displays. The conversations were complex and sometimes contentious, precisely because the wreck was not a neutral artifact, but also a place of mourning for families and nations. The sea's veil had been lifted, and with that unveiling came both responsibility and temptation. Environmental concerns added another layer. Deep-sea currents and the slow chemistry of corrosion were transforming the Titanic in ways both predictable and strange. Metal-eating microbes, organisms that thrive in darkness, feeding on iron and producing rusticles that draped like frozen waterfalls, were silently consuming the ship. Biological colonization, sediment movement, and chemical degradation meant the wreck was not static. It was a monument in decay, a slow-motion dissolution written in biological script. Scientists studying the site found themselves racing against natural processes, not to conquer the ocean, but to document a trenchant state before time and microbe erased more of the story. Culturally, the discovery rekindled fascination with the Titanic as metaphor and memory. Artists, writers, and filmmakers took up the image of the ruined liner as proof that human ambition, embroidered with complacency and arrogance, and founder spectacularly. Historians re-examined class dynamics and regulatory failures. The Titanic's images blue lit and haunting entered the visual language of the modern world, used to speak about loss, resilience, and the consequences of technological certainty. The wreck became a lens through which new generations peered, seeking meanings that resonated with their own fears and hopes. Not one surprising consequence of the discovery was how it democratized a piece of history. Before the wreck's rediscovery, the Titanic belonged mainly to survivors and archives. Afterward, it became part of a shared imagination. Museums displayed recovered objects. Documentaries showed plunges into the dark, and schoolrooms discussed the tale with renewed intensity. For many, the Titanic became at once a parable about hubris and a deeply human story about lives intersecting on a vessel bound for a new century. Its resurrection from anonymity made it available for collective reflection and cultural reinterpretation. Those who descended to photograph and sample the Titanic did more than recover relics. They created a map of memory. Photographs captured angles survivors could not have imagined, the opulence of a domestic world transported into wreckage, the efficiency of systems built for a different age, and the fragile, ephemeral nature of material belonging. Scientists cataloged items with archival scrupulousness, infusing recovery with duty, to record, to preserve, and to interpret. Each object housed a story, and each story demanded the patient work of contextualization, so that names and faces might be honored beyond the shock value of salvage. Inevitably, the discovery reopened wounds. Families of those who perished sometimes felt the opening of the wreck as a reopening of grief. The public appetite for artifacts occasionally collided with the emotional weight the site carried. Every artifact on display was a life reduced to an object. Every museum captioned an attempt to rejoin fragments into a coherent story. Curators and researchers bore a heavy responsibility to present artifacts not as curiosities, but as witnesses to human loss, and as invitations to empathy. In the years following the initial discovery, the Titanic's ruins continued to yield secrets. New technologies, higher resolution imaging, agile remote vehicles, and sophisticated conservation techniques offered deeper understanding while presenting tougher ethical choices. Should researchers bring more artifacts to the surface where they can be preserved and studied, or leave items as markers in the deep, part of the ship's quiet ecosystem? There is no tidy answer. Each choice balances knowledge against reverence, science against sentiment. The discovery of the Titanic taught something fundamental about humility. Modern engineering, which had promised absolute safety and control, proved fallible, not solely because of chance, but through a web of design, decisions, social structures, and technological limits. Investigations and reforms that followed the catastrophe changed maritime law, lifeboat regulations, and safety conventions. Tangible outcomes of a tragedy that, for all its horror, produced improvements in how people traveled by sea. Ultimately, finding the Titanic was like unearthing a mirror in which society glimpsed both its aspirations and its blind spots. The wreck's quiet presence on the ocean floor is a monument not only to those who perished, but to the complex relationship between humans and their machines. It reminds us that grandeur often carries risk, that innovation without humility can be catastrophic, and that memory is a fragile, salvageable thing. When the lights of a submersible dim and the machines rise back toward the sunlit world, the Titanic remains below changed, diminished, and yet more immediate than before. Its discovery transformed it from a date in a book into a tangible locus of history, empathy, and inquiry. To look at photographs of its bones is to be invited into a conversation across time. A conversation about how we imagine safety, how we value each other when disaster impends, and how the past continues to teach the living and demand vigilant remembrance.